delay. I think we're ready to go. It's 3:02 now, so.
Okay, you're good.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everybody to the TCOG meeting, our Zoom TCOG meeting. And I guess I'll call the meeting to order now. And I believe Greg asked me to make sure all the phone numbers are named. We've taken care of that, I believe. So the first item of business is approval of the minutes that Katrina provided us in the agenda. And so I'd like to open consideration of that and see if anybody has any corrections or additions for the minutes of February 27th.
Yeah, I didn't get them.
I didn't either.
Aha. They were in the agenda packet.
Didn't get that either.
Yeah, it's interesting because my agenda packet showed up. It was in my clutter file. So that's, and it came, I think that came out on Friday, maybe. Is that right, Katrina? So anyway, do we want to hold off until next meeting on approval of those?
Did everybody else get it?
I got
I'm
mine.
not sure that, I didn't see it with the invite, but I went to the website to pull it off.
Mm-hmm.
I
They were
received
sent out Friday morning.
I received it. It was there were two hyperlinks at the bottom of the invitation. One to view it online and one to download a PDF version of it. It was not an attachment.
Gotcha. Thank you.
That's right. Well, I guess I would suggest, since it's not a big deal, maybe we hold off on approval till the next meeting, and people have a chance who didn't have a chance can review those minutes.
Okay.
That sound good?
Good.
Okay,
Yes.
great. So then the next item of business is a report from county administration. Do we have that? Anyone from?
I don't think anyone's here from county administration.
Okay. Well, scratch that one.
Mark, I'm willing to chime in a little bit and give some county updates
Thank
if you'd
you.
like.
Okay, that'd be wonderful, Shauna.
Okay, I just wanted to let everyone know that 211 has been our resource to connect our constituents with some of the services that we have locally. If you have residents that are looking for housing or food, or if they need to do not have transportation and feel like they might be positive for COVID, they should be calling 211. The wonderful workers at 211 have absolutely everything they need at their fingertips in order to connect people with all the services within the county. The second thing is that the state is no longer offering Code Blue as part of our housing for people that need sheltering services. That ended as of April 15th. However, if people are homeless right now, the state of New York has reduced some of the expectations from homeless people so that they don't have to meet a long list of, for example, like going to detox or rehab. There's some other requirements that typically have to take place, and they are relaxing those requirements if someone is looking for housing. So I wanted to make people aware of that. And then, of course, the county is taking over the mask making effort right now. We're setting up in Bartles Hall. If anyone is sewers, or if you know of anyone in the community that has some sewing skills, please send them our way. We did receive many masks the other day from New York State. However, we're assuming that those are going to be handed out pretty quickly. So please send any sewers our way. And just wanted to, I'm sure that everyone on this call is aware, but every Thursday morning we have the local elected officials call with Jason And I believe Frank has been on most of those as well. Please feel free to attend those and ask your questions. I think they've been really helpful.
Great. Thank you, Shauna. Any questions for Shauna? Follow up?
I understood on the conference call this morning that there's also mask making going on at the BOCES gym. And that is also underway. And again, all of these masks that are coordinated by the county are to be used by people in essential services.
That's right.
Thanks, Bob. Any other contributions or thoughts? Great. Thank you, Shauna.
Thank you.
I'll move on to my transit services report. And so this report is from our March 25th meeting of the Transit Services Group. And obviously the agenda for that meeting was transformed mostly to COVID-19 related concerns around public transportation. And it is some of these items from my notes may be a little bit different now, but TCAT has adopted measures to reduce the spread of or the potential spread of COVID-19, and they've been working to protect the staff and drivers. The facilities undergo a professional grade cleaning every day. They've reduced density in the break room. The buses are disinfected nightly, and they have a work rotation of two days on, 3 days off. There was the suggestion at the meeting, and I don't know if it's, I have ridden the bus recently and it wasn't required, but there was a suggestion for passengers to use the back door of the bus, which I thought was a good idea. TCAT has instituted, because of this, significant service reductions and changes. So they're at 35% of their normal operations. They've gone from 42 buses to 17 buses. Ironically, perhaps, the service for rural routes has been, all rural routes have 4 round trips a day, 7 days a week, and no night service. And for like the 52 out in Caroline, that's actually, that's really great. So that's especially for our weekend service. And Route 13 has been shortened and provides service mostly for North Side and Fall Creek. There was a discussion following this, moving beyond the COVID measures of the TCAT is planning to establish its new facilities near the airport. And there was a discussion of multimodal facilities ideas for that location. And then I'll just note that recent updates, not at the meeting, but recent updates for TCAT is that I think most people know in this committee, we've had several discussions over the last couple of years about providing fare-free transit. So, well, we're doing that now, and that's happening until at least May 23rd. So there's no fare requirement on the bus. And also recently now they're requiring riders to wear masks. So if you're riding the bus, you should wear a mask. So that's my report. Are there any questions?
Mark, with regard to the multimodal up by the airport, what are the multi-modes?
Well, I think they were thinking about it as a transportation hub, could provide service for. It was a brief discussion, and I sort of lapsed in my notes, but I think people were thinking about ways to. It could be for it might make sense to have connections with other transit options in this area with TCAT and the airport there. And there was a talk of what kind of facilities they might want to have there to support that kind of thing, like gym facilities or cafeterias or things like that. So that's about all I have on that.
Mark, I took part in a TCAT Zoom conference that I think was after the 25th of March. And this was discussed, and it sounded like like it was a wish list and very, very preliminary, and as though, you know, they're going to have something that's probably going to be more sophisticated and more extensive and expensive than the participants in TCAT are probably going to undertake. So it's a long range type of thing, and I wouldn't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Anybody else? Anything related to
It's
transit?
it's Nancy from Ulysses, and I just had a quick question about this multimodal and sort of what that bigger thinking looked like. And I know there have been thoughts off and on over the years about a central facility that might enable town highway departments to get some of our bigger trucks serviced. And I didn't know whether that was on anybody's horizon or not. I mean, we have developed over the years some in-house capacity, so we don't send as many of our highway trucks out for third-party repairs, but we still do that on occasion. And I just had no idea what capacity there was or wasn't, or if it's not even an issue.
Great. Okay, I think it's a great idea. So I'll bring it up at the next meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Mark, this is Dan. What did you say the ridership was the last time you checked? It was like 30%? Because I think it's a lot lower now.
Oh, riders, I
So
didn't report,
about-
right. I was
Anyone has
reporting,
updated numbers?
I was reporting the buses, the bus deployment. I don't have the information on ridership, but it's
Yeah.
down quite a bit.
Yeah, I spoke with Matt Yarrow last week. He came and spoke to my class at Cornell,
Okay.
came through Zoom. So they're down to about 1,000 trips per day, 1,000 riders a day from, you know, a peak of what they would do earlier in the month, around 18,000.
Wow.
So they're cratering in terms of ridership, not surprisingly.
Yeah.
But since fares make up about 1/3 of their budget, this is kind of a big deal and something we all need to watch. And we don't want to see any long-term harm done to this system.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thanks.
Maybe it, yeah.
All right. Does anybody know if any of the federal bills passed so far have anything like federal assistance for transit systems, and whether we can take advantage of that?
Reed just had a meeting and he did bring up the fact that, and I don't know exactly where, but there was some money that could be available for transit. How we go about it, I need to contact Reed, his office. But he did mention that there was some money out there. It didn't clear to me because I don't know anything about transportation.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. Anybody else? Any information? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome.
Great. Okay, I guess if there's nothing further for transit services, I'll move on to the report from our 4 subcommittees reports. And so the first one on our list is yours, George, with the water quality. Do you have a report for us?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, we had our water quality subcommittee meeting last week, first one. It was a good meeting. The one bad thing was I couldn't get Joe Whitmore hooked up on his phone because the Zoom platform I was using is there. Let us hook his phone up. So, but I think next time we're going to solve that problem thanks to Tian Hunter and the Cayuga Lake Watershed Intermunicipal Organization. They already have a Zoom thing hooked up, so we have solved that problem. The main thing I bring from that meeting last week is a tremendous amount of work already going on regarding water quality in our community and surrounding communities. There's the Cayuga Lake Watershed Intermunicipal Organization, which they all refer to as the IO.
Mhm.
It involves 3 counties surrounding Cayuga Lake. There's the Water Resources Council, and a lot of this work's been going on for years, and there's really knowledgeable people working on water quality. So what we brought out of our meeting is a few goals. One is to communicate all these things that are going on better. And the people in the subcommittee felt that TCOG is a great avenue or a great place to do that because we are an intermunicipal group. So they offered a couple things. One, to make a presentation at a TCOG to outline all the things that are going on now, so that we as a group can get that information. Another goal is in the same vein is for all these groups to better understand what each other is doing. I think we can do that through TCOG. And finally, they want to know what the members of TCOG would like from our subcommittee. What projects, what data we would be interested in pursuing. I guess that's all I got to say. I get lost after I talk a while. So.
Okay, thanks, George. Anybody have questions for George?
Well, gee, I thought that I kind of expected the other way around, rather than the committee coming back to the group saying, what do you want us to do? I'm kind of expecting the committee to come back to saying, here's what we propose to do. But
Well, I think that it would be helpful. I like the idea of having a presentation because there are lots of different groups with slightly with similar but slightly different missions and services or purposes. So I would look forward to that presentation. And then I have a feeling that after I heard that, and maybe this is true for others, we then might say, well, this initiative sounds really good and could be helpful to our municipality. You know, we endorse that or move forward with this, or wait, out of all that the efforts I heard, this or that was missing. And so I would see, I don't think I'm not, as a relatively new member of TCOG, sort of not prepared to sort of say what TCOG wants right now, but I think we might have a sense after the presentation. But I agree, Joel. That if there are asks or requests or recommendations for TCOG members, I'd be certainly open to hearing those proposals and figuring out if we can take, any collective action on anything.
One thing that I think did come out of that meeting and the meeting I attended last night was the feeling that, and this is, people have been working on watershed issues for a number of years, the feeling that it would be helpful to, in organizing all these efforts and avoiding duplication, to have a watershed manager, a paid or paid by a number of municipalities to oversee the watershed issues on Cayuga Lake. There actually is one on Canandaigua Lake that they think does a really good job, and there's one that just was hired overseeing the watershed of Seneca Lake. So that's one thing they may look for as a goal.
I had heard that, and I agree with Nancy that a good starting place for the group as a whole would be to sort of have the review that you proposed, George, where we see what all is going on and can get a better sense for what's missing. And that would certainly inform the discussion too about whether a watershed coordinator is warranted.
I just thought of something. Overview of things that have been worked on so far. It's really thorough and really good, and I'm hoping I can figure out how to forward it to all of you so you can read that. I think that would be helpful.
Shauna, did you have a comment?
Yes, I certainly think that this is a very warranted position. But I would just remind our colleagues, like the situation that we're in right now. And I know that the city just announced that they're, perhaps furloughing 25% of their work staff. I know the county is going to be looking at our budget mid-year, and it would be very difficult to enter a new position at this time whenever we're facing some layoffs. So I just want to, kind of put that out there and keep this on people's mind.
True that.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense to me. And I guess I would, my sense is that we would want to be thinking about longer term, what we want to see for the longer term post-COVID. And so that's all. Anything else for George? Great. Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Transportation's up next. I think that's Bob. Is that right?
Yes, it is. We have not met at this point because of all the COVID-related matters that have come up. And we hope to get together and before the next meeting and to wrestle with some of the issues. Of course, as was discussed earlier, because of COVID, the focus probably is on TCAT and the TCAT cutbacks. But again, this is short-term, I hope. Eventually, long-term, I hope we can look toward some of the more ambitious objectives, shall we say, expanding TCAT service maybe, and also for a centralized transit station downtown Ithaca. We haven't looked at it yet.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Any follow-up for Bob and his committee? All right, energy. I think that's Rod. So
First, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I just want to say that no disrespect is intended. The fact that I'm wearing a baseball cap. I need a haircut and I'm not ready to cut my own hair. So we met on March 26th, and that was Joel Gagnon, Ronnie Hardaway, Shauna Black, Donna Fleming, Heather McCarthy. I think I got that name right. McCarthy? It's not McCarthy, right? Does anyone know? Heather McCarthy, Terry Carroll, and myself. Joanna James was not able to participate. This is the statement we use to start the discussion. The goal is to identify energy initiatives that would benefit by intermunicipal cooperation and by discussion and implementation via TCOG. Further, we do not want to duplicate the efforts of any other committees or boards. So then we went into just kind of a brainstorming mode to talk about what would be some possibilities. I won't share the whole list. I think the minutes, if they're not already, they'll be up on the TCOG website. So look at intermunicipal cooperation related to location of solar farms was one. Those of us who are involved in the climate smart communities and have taken the pledge and have taken steps, how are we going about making that pledge real and sharing information along those lines? Address reducing energy consumption for existing buildings, which is a tall order. Focus development in nodal areas. Create an energy knowledge hub for municipalities. Share ideas for how each municipality is addressing their own government operations via an energy lens. And we spent probably the most time talking about community choice aggregation, CCA. My understanding is that there was a past subcommittee of this group that focused on that. In fact, some of you probably were involved in that. I did have a follow-up conversation with Irene Weiser just to learn more about the previous work of that committee. I also had a conversation with Darby Kiley, who's the county staff person to the, I think I got the name right, the Climate and Sustainability Advisory Board, because we did not want to duplicate any efforts of initiatives that they might want to focus on. Of course, they're an advisory board, but she made it sound like CCA would not be an area that was probably appropriate for that group to pick up and run with, but there might be some support. And those of you involved with that advisory board may have something different to say about that. I did send a link out to the subcommittee. There's a CCA toolkit that was shared recently through the Southern Tier Clean Energy Communities newsletter. So certainly there's information, and CCA, you know, I'm pretty excited if CCA is the area that we decide to focus in on for now. What I got from Irene and others is that the timing didn't seem right last time a group looked at CCA, but there might have been enough changes and variables that the time might be more ripe now. So we're not coming with a strong recommendation yet, but I think you might hear more about CCA being an area of a potential focus. But I want to see if any of the subcommittee members who were part of that want to chime in.
I was on that committee, Rod, but I don't really have anything to add. The way you summarized it is my sense too, and I think Irene chaired that committee and knows a lot more about it. So sounds good. It's exciting.
Is anyone here from well, Terry, I think you chair the Climate and Sustainability Advisory Board. So what I gleaned from my conversation with Darby, is that correct? In terms of CCA probably not being, well, again, you're an advisory board, so I don't even know if you take on initiatives.
Yeah, so that group right now is still, you know, we've only met once officially, so I think we're still in the process of deciding exactly what the priorities are going to be. I think it's fair to say that if, you know, CCA is a part of it, it'll look very different from what a TCOG group would do. I think we're mainly looking at how we can advise the county, and the county's role within a CCA is a lot less than what an average municipalities might be. So I think you're fairly accurate, and Darby was accurate in saying that.
And on the website for the Energy Subcommittee, if it's not there now, there will be a link to that toolkit. I mean, it's a very big toolkit. It's pretty exhaustive. So anyway, there would be some guidelines that we could walk through, and those examples of other governments who have taken a CCA approach from a multi-jurisdictional perspective.
If I can add a few words, Rod, this is Irene.
Sure.
So Rod and I spoke, and Terry, to kind of further your comments too, what I mentioned to Rod is that there were several people on the county committee that were very interested in CCA, and I thought my understanding was for us to talk to TCOG, that it seemed to be a better fit there, and there was nothing to prohibit those of us who were on the county committee but were interested in CCA from working with TCOG on that. And so we very much like to do that, Rob. I'm not sure, are you referring to the NYSERDA toolkit that's posted online, or what that toolkit is? Terry's nodding yes. Because I had also forwarded to you, I believe, the CCA 3.0 report that has been issued by a group called Local Power.
Yep.
Local Power is run by a man named Paul Fenn, who those of you who did CCA previously, Paul is kind of like the father of CCA in this country. He started it out in California. He's helped to propagate it, and I think it's in like 7 or 8 states now across the country. And he's got, I think, a really robust, exciting model for looking at CCA in ways that are more than just building some renewables, but are really looking at energy efficiency and a bunch of things. So I'm very interested. I think there's a bunch of people from the previous committee who are interested, from the case committee who are, the county committee that are interested. And so I'd really like to get some clarity with you, Rod, about how we might move CCA forward, because I think there's a lot of interest, and I'd like to see that happen. And frankly, I'd like to be part of the TCOG committee. I am an alternate member of TCOG, and I'd like to be part of that energy committee too.
Great. Yeah, so we are set to meet again on May 28th. So we were following that every other month schedule. So I don't think committee members will, if we focus pretty heavily at CCA at that meeting, I think people will be open to that, and we can figure out what some next steps are. And we might follow the same lead that the water quality group would be, and just make some presentations about CCA to this broader group in the future.
That would be great. Is there a listserv or some way for me to get notices about that?
Yeah, we'll add you to that.
Great, thanks.
Looks like George had a question.
Yeah, George?
Yeah, could you say again, Rod, what CCA stands for?
Community Choice Aggregation. Does that help you at all? Terry could give you
I don't know what aggregation means.
Terry, I'm going to rely on you to just give 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'll try and do even faster than that. Essentially, when you look at your electricity bill, you are charged by NYSEG for supply and demand. When New York State, basically deregulated the electricity markets and made it so that the utility companies were no longer the power producers, they gave every, basically utility company or utility customer the ability to choose who their supplier was for electricity. So most people default to NYSEG. But some people do decide to go with an energy supply company. What CCA does is it gives the municipality the right to decide what the default option is for residents in their area. And it becomes an opt-out. So any resident that decides not to choose who their electricity supply company is will be put onto the energy supply company of choice by the municipality unless they decide to opt out of the program. Generally, this is done to either get lower prices for the residents or to try and move the residents to green, clean energy, or both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Anything else for Rod on CCAs or anything else related to energy?
I'll chime in that I'm very glad to see Irene getting engaged with the group. That'll help a lot.
Great, thank you, Rod.
Thanks, Joel.
I'll now give our the report for our emergency services group. That's Roridan Hart and Beth McGee and Irene Weiser and I are working on that small group. We've had a couple of meetings now, and I'm going to summarize from the minutes I provided for the second meeting. So the, hang on a sec, I've got the wrong page. So we discussed what the essential steps and goals we feel are to create a sustainable structure for fire and EMS services in rural parts of New York State. And I think we all recognize that there's a need for this. And the key obstacle is funding for local municipalities, a heavy lift to establish and support these services. It was pointed out that the current coronavirus pandemic really highlights the need for this right now. So it actually is an ideal time to advocate for this kind of support. And then there was the recognition that, or the acknowledgement that there needs to be an explicit recognition of emergency medical services as a healthcare. I will say that a lot of these ideas are informed by Roridan's experience in Trumansburg. So our long-term goal that we identified was funding to municipalities for these services. And we feel like there's a way to do this would be to have local officials advocate with the county legislature and federal and state officials for funding from higher levels of government, especially the state. And we proposed as an immediate action item to offer a resolution at our June TCOG meeting to request the Tompkins County Legislature ask the Assembly to put forth legislation for a CHIPS model for providing support for municipal EMS services. So that's a tangible thing that we would like to move forward. Immediate goals and actions that we identified, fire protection contracts like the ones we have in the town of Caroline for your municipal fire protection districts are often outdated, and ours certainly are. And so we feel like there's, it might be a good function of TCOG to help all of us address, review our fire protection contracts if we have municipal fire protection districts, and get assistance in updating those. And it's a serious issue because if you're not compliant, it can lead to, or it could lead to vulnerability, lack of insurance coverage, should there be a claim. And then the other thing that we identified was to learn about the essentials for providing EMS and ambulance service in rural areas by seeking out experts and looking at case studies. So our recommendations are for the next discussions to bring the experiences and perspectives in from broader areas at the county level, and county administration and emergency response to get their feedback and input. Engage with local fire and EMS providers, for the same, for their information and support. And then there is a resource. So there's a legal expert, Brad Pinsky, who regularly presents training at the Association of Towns. And so we wanted to, we proposed to consider engaging him to work with us to do trainings on fire protection contracts and rural EMS services. And so that's a summary of what we talked about. A lot of this is informed by Rorden's experiences and knowledge from Trumansburg. And I'm going to stop there. And I guess I'd first ask, I don't think Beth's with us, but Rorden and Irene, if they have anything to add to that. Or open it for discussion or questions. Joel?
Is this, is the driver here the need to be thinking about paid providers as opposed to having volunteers provide these services?
That's a potential solution. I think the driver is the need. But
I mean, it's a potential but very expensive solution, but
that's, I see what you're saying by me mentioning, so Rorden brought forth the idea that we, in order to support this for local municipalities, we need funding from higher levels of government, the state. So yeah, I think.
Well, and that's what prompted my question. We need funding. The funding would be to have some people actually hired to do the job as opposed to volunteering to do the job. Is that right? Or?
I think that's a likely outcome.
Yeah, basically, Joel, to answer that question from the perspective of the village of Trumansburg, we went to a paid staff back in 2000. And we had a hybrid setup between a paid EMS staff and some volunteers. And within 7 years, we were a 24/7 paid operation.
Yeah.
That had everything to do with simply the realities of maintaining certification for most volunteer EMTs and paramedics being so high in the state of New York that it really was not viable for many to do that if they had some other full-time job. And so when I look at kind of how successful ambulance departments around this part of the state operate, and I include, Dryden in that category, of course, and there are others in the region outside of the for-profit model, which requires a certain call volume to be successful, like Bangs is, you end up with basically a heavily taxpayer subsidized paid ambulance service, which either covers a particular area or for that municipality itself, or grows to cover a much wider area with contracts between the providing municipality and the surrounding towns, which is the specific situation we have here in Trumansburg. So it's become a mission of mine, and I've already had conversations with various folks at the state level. Congressman Reed's office is actually very interested in this as well, because they have other municipalities in Western New York in the New York 23rd Congressional District that have this same problem where they're losing ambulance coverage. There's no one to pick it up, and they're kind of trying to figure out, how do we cover this? And I had a conversation with a town supervisor from a town in Chautauqua County whose ambulance coverage was provided by the local hospital, which operated an ambulance on a for-profit basis. But because this ambulance company had become largely a critical care transport agency, they didn't actually have emergency coverage within the town. And so this town supervisor who I spoke with was trying to figure out what's it going to cost to stand up an ambulance company if we have to pay them, what's involved in getting certificates of need for the area. And, those numbers add up very quickly. And so the model is basically and as Mark said, I hate to say that there's anything good that comes out of the situation with COVID, but if we're looking for tiny silver linings, one One thing that has come out of this is now, maybe finally, depending on what we think of the governor's attitude to small municipalities, finally there's a recognition that these emergency services are actually necessary, that there's actually an importance when it comes to things like EMS. So if there's a way to develop a model so that the village of Trumansburg or the town of Dryden or whoever is a large scale municipal provider of this service can get funding from the state using either a CHIPS or even a STOA, state operating assistance model, the way they do for transit, something along those lines that says, hey, you have a department already. We're not going to subsidize bangs, but we're going to help subsidize the towns that contract with the villages or the villages themselves. That's going to be a really heavy lift when New York State is 10 to $15 billion in the hole. But my pitch to anyone who will listen in Albany is that if the appropriate role of government is not to provide emergency services to the residents, then there is no appropriate role for government. And I think that this is a good opportunity for Tompkins County to begin to advocate and push for that, because there is not a volunteer solution. I know, and we had this discussion at some length on one of our committee meetings. I know that every time the topic comes up, well-meaning individuals say that if we can just do enough recruiting, we can get our volunteer numbers back up enough to cover all of these areas. And that's highly altruistic and unfortunately not a reality. There just isn't a way that you could stand up enough volunteers to cover the 1,000 calls that the village of Trumansburg EMS department covers, or the multiple of that the town of Dryden ambulance company covers. So the answer is either we don't have ambulance or we pay for it somehow. And I think the only way to really pay for it without pricing everyone out of their homes is to get Albany to step up to the plate on that.
Dan?
Next question.
Yep.
Yeah. Hey, so it sounds like you're combining the two funding needs for ambulance and fire and this petition to Albany. Am I understanding that right, Rorden? You're saying let's make a combined ask for both EMS and fire protection with a new system, a new funding stream?
I'm actually not necessarily suggesting that. Fire is,
they're different.
Yeah, they're different. They're intertwined. Like, I don't know. I'll try not to get myself in trouble. I'll just refer to the village. Here in the village, it's ambulance evolved out of the fire company. So there's always going to be something of a stepbrother, stepsister type relationship between the two departments. But the reality is that ambulance has evolved over the last 20 to 30 years to become a piece of the healthcare system. It's not firefighters performing CPR. It's highly trained, high level medicine. The requirements on paramedics are half a step below essentially physician's assistants in some cases. There are not that many things that a paramedic can't do in the field. And so an acknowledgement by both the state and federal government, which is part of my ongoing conversation with Reed's office, is that we talk about health care, health insurance, the provision of all things health. EMS needs to be acknowledged as being a part of that. Now, what that does to fire companies, that's where the conversation diverged slightly. And Beth from the town of Enfield was clear that for all of the towns that contract, again, the village is in a different situation. We have an all volunteer department that only exists within the confines of the village, because village law relating to fire companies is different than town law relating to fire companies. But certainly for any town that contracts with an independent fire company, you have a contractual obligation and a contractual relationship with it, which is slightly different than the municipal provision of paid ambulance. So I think the ask on the fire side has much more to do with education, making sure that municipalities are properly educated on the complexities of fire contracts, to make sure that your contracts are well put together, both for the the protection of the taxpayer on the town side, but also for the protection of the fire company volunteer members. What I see anecdotally is that fire companies are under stress for volunteers, but not nearly to the extent that ambulances. We essentially don't have any ambulance volunteers anymore. You have one or two here and there. Fire companies, you have demographic issues. You have, some fire companies aging out of relevance in some areas of New York State, but God bless them, young men and women still do find it attractive to want to run into burning buildings while the rest of us are trying to get out. So there's an attraction to the firefighter service, at least what I see on our end, that sustains that a little bit better. On the ambulance side, it's become, for me, it's become a funding issue because we need paid staff.
So the reason why I'm bringing this up is I've been focused on a more targeted ask when it comes to Albany and ambulance service. And that has to do with increasing the Medicaid reimbursement rate for ambulance calls. And here in Dryden, 2/3 of our calls are Medicaid, and Medicaid only covers 2/3 of the cost of those calls. So in this year, when the governor may be taking up Medicaid reform, there's some chatter about that since he didn't get his way in the budget. It may come up later in the year, some sort of Medicaid reform. This could be a good time to make that push. I actually brought this up directly to Lieutenant Governor Hochul about 2 months ago, and her response was, well, you should consider privatizing your ambulance services. Not exactly the response we wanted to hear. But I think this could be an issue where we have a targeted ask on the ambulance issue, and I mean the Medicaid reimbursement issue, and to Albany this year. Sorry, I missed the opportunity to sign up for one of these committees. I guess you did that at the last meeting we held, and this would be an interesting issue for me to be involved in. I might want to join your committee.
Great, so you're on.
Yeah, that's.
You don't want to do a background check or something, because I got some pretty sketchy things.
That's a good suggestion, Dan. I mean, Medicaid reimbursement is kind of what it is, and that may even be something we could talk about with Reed. We'll take more money anywhere we can get it, but I don't know that it addresses kind of the broader issue of, do we want these services provided to the residents rurally or not? Which is essentially something that we need to pin Albany down on. And I'm interested that you mentioned that about the lieutenant governor, because before the coronavirus showed up, she was on my short list of people to get to in the next couple of months through a mutual acquaintance. And that's something that is it's a mythology. Of course, she's from Buffalo, so she gets upstate New York, but Buffalo is not Trumansburg or Dryden. So the kind of the knee-jerk answer from Albany of, well, just privatize it. I think if we can make or get folks like the lieutenant governor to understand that you don't just magically privatize something when there's no private entity willing to do it. We offered Bangs our area back in 2009, and they basically said, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to lose money on your 1,000 calls if we pick up your area. So we'll do it for you if you pay us. And they gave us a number which was more than our existing budget. So I think that, you all understand that, but I'm sure that most everyone in Albany does not.
Yeah, a profit-driven company is not going to pick up one of these unprofitable areas. I mean, that's why they're nonprofits, and that's why we're begging people to come work for us in these services.
Nancy, do you have a question? No. Okay. Great.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If we get, I was going to ask for a little bit of the sort of a recapitulation of the history. How do we get ourselves in this position? You spoke, Gordon, to the question to some degree by talking about how it's easier to recruit on the fire side than it is on the emergency response side. And taking a historical perspective, I mean, the fire companies kind of got into this over time, responding to calls and finding, they weren't always fires and people were hurt and they were sort of filling in while they wait for the ambulance to show up. And then the training requirements escalated, and now it takes so much time to be trained that you could actually be, you could be a paramedic for less effort. So why would anybody volunteer that kind of time? It's a huge amount of time. So hasn't state kind of created this problem by raising the training requirements to the point where a volunteer requires so much training that you can't recruit volunteers to do?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, I think personal experiences are always anecdotal at the end of the day, but, looking at it from the village's perspective, our first ambulance was, I think 1967, was a donated old hearse from the Bud Ness, who was founder of the Ness Sibley Funeral Home, donated a hearse and retrofitted it with a first aid kit, and they called it an ambulance. And so you look at it from the late 60s to present, the requirements have changed so much that our last volunteer paramedic, who ended up deciding she wanted to go over to the paid side of our department, ironically, she had been a volunteer paramedic with us for almost 20 years at the time. And she summed it up best when she just said, if I'm going to do it anyway, I might as well get paid to do it. And so when you have to maintain that level of certification and expertise, you're right, Joel, you're just simply not going to get people to do it, at least not at any scale, and do it for free when they have to maintain that level of certification. Is it a state caused problem? Probably. I think a lot of things can be unintended consequences of things over time. But I don't think we get the toothpaste back in that tube. I mean, if it is, as I believe it is, part of the healthcare system now, paramedics in the field, you're not going to see any health department really in any state in the country back off of health certification requirements or training requirements for people who are rendering care. They'll let a certain amount of it be done by volunteers, but even a volunteer EMT, once it gets to a certain level of care, they have to stop rendering the care, or they can only maintain, they can do chest compressions, but they can't take that next step without the right amount of certification. So I don't know that there's a way to go back on that.
Mhm.
We kind of are where we are, and so it's just a matter of how do we adapt to it.
It certainly sounds like, we come to a fork in the road here where it's no longer sustainable to have that service be associated with the fire companies. And you might want to rethink the whole situation and say, if this is not something that you're simply responding to because, an emergency call came in, maybe we need a whole separate organizational structure to deal with that medical need rather than the fire need. And that's kind of the direction you headed, right?
Well, that is what we did. So back in 2000, it was actually a function of going to billing for ambulance services that we separated out the department in 2009. So we're about 11 years in, maybe it was 2010. We're 10 or 11 years into operating an EMS department as a completely separate, wholly owned department of the village. And so although they share a building, there's certainly a lot of overlap. I mean, if there's a two-car accident, you're getting a couple of fire trucks and the ambulance at the scene. So there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of coordination, but they are completely separate departments. And so the EMS department contracts with our partners in the surrounding towns to provide ambulance coverage in that area. And part of this conversation with Albany and anyone else who will listen is, village of Trumansburg is 1.2 square miles. I mean, you have a hard time finding anyone in DC who can locate it on a map. But our ambulance coverage area is 112 square miles. So we cover over 100 square miles in between Cayuga and Seneca Lake down into, deep into Schuyler County. And the concern obviously comes up, and I think this would be true in any rural area. The concern comes up, what if adjacent ambulance companies, some of which are still partially volunteer, all of which have staffing issues, what if any of them stop being able to provide calls? So we have a contracted coverage area of 112 square miles. We provide automatic mutual aid to an area almost twice that. So if we are traveling 40 miles into Schuyler County and then transporting a patient to Strong Memorial, that's not a coverage area technically, but it's a huge lift for a small department. And then we start to get into the conversation, and this is something Nancy and I always talk about. We started to get into the conversation of, okay, that ambulance is transporting a heart attack patient to Strong Memorial. Who's covering back home? who's the ambulance that's going to take that next call in the town of Ulysses, who we've actually contracted with, and they're paying us for that coverage, but our ambulance is on the road. So these are big issues that honestly, the answer is more staffing, more coverage, which means more money. But you can't just drop that on the back of taxpayers. And I don't want to stay on the soapbox too long, but you can tell it's a hot button one for me. My biggest fear is that, every once in a while, I'll get a village resident who says, I don't think that our ambulance for our small village should be covering such a small area at such a high cost. And I explain everything I just explained to you, and they will back off of that position a little. My biggest fear is that somewhere down the road, some village board gets elected, some mayor gets elected who says, let's retreat to our borders and build a wall, and everyone else is on their own. And then now the 911 call for the 3-year-old in respiratory distress across the Seneca County line, a 9-iron from my house, doesn't get an ambulance because we, quote, can't go there. I don't want to be anywhere near that situation. And I think the only way to really take that off the table is some type of a broader approach to state and even federal funding for that type of service.
Thanks, Jordan. This is a great discussion. I'm going to end it here. We've got a couple more presenters. So, I'm going to, Dan, you're on the committee if you'd like to be, so thank you. So with that, I'll move on to code enforcement report from Brooke Greenhouse. Brooke, are you still here? With
okay, can you hear me now?
Okay, yeah, okay.
Great. So I guess the report will be relatively brief. I'm going to go into a small tangent if that's okay afterwards, but basically things have been largely shut down in terms of having any kind of physical meeting, and I think the Zoom meeting is a pretty big lift for the group based on the very helter-skelter email communication. But essentially, one of the big wins that starting this code enforcement communication group, which is mostly based in email, is we've got a really good communication happening with the health department. So it's a one-way communication from the health department, where they're sharing good information with code officials, and code officials as individuals who wish to respond to them reply, and then it generally is seen by everyone. So the hard part right now is, since we're not in any kind of a group setting, is trying to understand what the silent majority is thinking. So hopefully later this year, we'll have an in-person meeting and start to get some kind of sense of what folks are thinking. The state government has done a very poor job of communicating our responsibilities during the pandemic. I personally took it upon myself to constantly go through executive orders and tease things out. It's that ridiculous, and we have this combination of executive orders, very little information from the Department of State, which is essentially who we sort of report to in code enforcement, and then the third component is Empire State Development, which sort of interprets the executive orders. So there have been bits and pieces of information that are really critical for code enforcement, that some of which have literally just been available to the majority of us by sharing through this email group. So I'm very thankful that we were able to get a lot of participation in sharing those emails last year, because one of the most important things we can do right now is be a little bit more consistent in our response to what's allowed and what's not allowed. And it was discovered that there were one or more code enforcement officials who weren't quite interpreting ESD's guidance on the allowability of a single worker on a construction site the same as the majority was. And they were shutting down and stopping work that was allowable. So luckily, one of the code officials, Marty Mosley in the town of Ithaca, was able to get a written determination from Empire State Development. I don't know how he did it. It was fantastic, because I've been trying to get that for over a week. And then we were able to share it with everyone, and it sort of opened up a lot of people's minds to what's allowable. So on balance, it's not as sexy an organization right now as we'd like it to be, but it seems to be effective in at least getting some information out and trying to fill in some holes. So it's a really good thing. We've just got to keep it going.
Great.
And then the only other I think important thing for all of you folks to be aware of is that under the executive orders, code enforcement responsibilities have expanded, not contracted. So the first most important thing that I got a report today that one town official doesn't seem to realize, one code enforcement officer, is code enforcement is an essential operation right now. Code enforcement should not be and is not shut down in any way, shape, or form. Our responsibilities and our work processes have definitely changed, but there's an implied expectation that we're playing a role in trying to make sure that job sites are not occupied when they're not supposed to be with more than one worker, that we're taking an active role in determining when things are either essential or allowable under the code. So an easy example is if before the executive orders, one had a house that was framed up part way, there's no requirement that work stop and it be abandoned. It actually can be allowed to proceed because a vacant structure is unsafe in the eyes of the code, and unsafe structures are allowed to be worked on under the executive orders. And some code officials aren't quite connecting the dots because no one really explains it that clearly to anyone, unfortunately. So there are projects in my municipality that were, I don't know, about 2/3 done in the framing stage, and I directed them to finish but follow social distancing and good hygiene practices. And then I just have to pay attention to them. And then at other job sites, I go out and I educate them that they have to close down and go home, and I give them a warning. And if they don't comply with the warning, a code official has, I guess I would say, probably 3 opportunities. One is under the Uniform Building Code, we can issue stop work orders and fines and things like that, and move it forward through that process. The second is we can contact the police and have people removed physically from the site, which is consistent with the executive order. And the third component is we could report them to the health department, and the health department can work under public health law. So, so rather than having less to do, in some ways, I don't know that we have more things to do, but we have more significant things to do.
Sure.
And a few of us are just trying to keep the email communication going. And then I worked, I think, with Katrina's help to start posting things to a website hosted at the county level. And once we get a little more information up there, I'm going to try to push other code officials' awareness of that website. So we have a little more streamlined information, because the guidance is so confusing. It's really unfortunate.
Mhm.
And that's it about code enforcement.
Mark, we're not hearing you.
Sorry. Wow. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Whoops. No.
Can't hear you again.
Wow. Can you hear me now? No.
Yes.
You can.
Yes.
Wow. You had a proposal about Stormwater Coalition. Is that right?
Somewhat. So it dovetails in, I think, to some of the really interesting things that George shared earlier about how we have things siloed and we have overlap and things like that. But basically at the Stormwater Coalition, we have had a couple of really fantastic presentations. One of them had to do specifically with stormwater management, and I think how Chemung County handled it. And the other one had to do with logging. And basically what they were explaining to us was that a lot of just in broad brushes, then I'll get specific into stormwater, but a lot of municipalities have trouble managing these issues because they're fragmented and inconsistent, specifically like with logging. And I can't remember if it was Schuyler County, but someone came up with a county-wide program that was not onerous. It was far more about compliance than crazy paperwork or enforcement. And they made great strides in managing the stormwater related and road damage from logging. But the critical way that they did that was they had a county-wide standard. So everyone going into that county knows exactly what's expected of them. They have a minimal fee. And my understanding is the top priorities are they're given a booklet which essentially describes best practices, and they're forced to get in contact with a highway super, which is the primary person who deals with a lot of the shenanigans related to logging. So it was a very exciting opportunity that I'm not sure that anyone's really pushed forward. So I wanted to bring that up to TCOG.
Perfect.
And the second item was in Chemung County, I guess, there was basically a realization that most municipalities cannot effectively have a good stormwater program because there's a lot of expertise in it that's very different than the planners and code enforcement officials that are typically tasked with it. So while it doesn't compete with the responsibilities of an EMT that Gordon was talking about, there's a lot to know and a lot to keep up on. There are all kinds of associations and organizations one can join. And essentially it's a setup for any moderate to small sized town. It's really a setup for failure because you have the obligations and more importantly to consider the liabilities of a large this is no different than a larger municipality, but there's just no way that we have the resources to keep up on top of it. So what they created was a centralized stormwater management process that doesn't eliminate local enforcement and participation, but it takes the medium to higher level review responsibilities and even inspection responsibilities that require a trained professional. It moved it at the county level.
Right.
So you had a small group of true experts that were managing it all.
Okay.
And the other component that they did that was really cool was they managed all of the robust paperwork. So it's organized and available.
Cool. I just wanted to get that out there. We should move on because Terry and Lou have joined us for the stretch code discussions. So thank you, Brooke.
You're welcome.
Is that Chemung County that you were talking about, Brooke?
Chemung County was the stormwater program. I don't remember the logging program.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. So I want to turn it over to Terry and Lou to introduce they want to do a presentation on the stretch code, and I apologize for squeezing you down to the end of the meeting. So please go ahead.
No, yeah, thank you. We appreciate
Terry's going to start the introduction. I wondered how much time we do have left.
Well, our meeting goes till 4:30 and we try to end about that time. So can you do justice to that or with that?
I can, I can. I'll just do what I skip over some slides.
If we go over a little bit, that's okay with me. I don't know what others think, but.
Yeah, I'll just give a quick introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Lou. I think I know most of you on the call. I'm Terry Carroll. I work on the Clean Energy Communities program at Cooperative Extension. The Clean Energy Communities program is a NYSERDA program that has helped municipalities with clean energy actions. I think I've worked with almost every municipality in Tompkins County. Many of you are designated clean energy communities. I think many of you have gotten grants. I was adding up the math earlier, and I think we brought over $700,000 to the county to various municipalities for clean energy projects in the last iteration of the program. We anticipate that there's going to be a new program starting in the fall, so I'll be getting in touch with many of you again at that point. Hopefully try and get at least another $700,000, if not more. So look forward to talking to all of you in the future. Today, however, we're talking about something that's outside of the clean energy communities at this point. It's the New York Stretch Code. NYSERDA has asked myself and Lou to basically go to each municipality in the southern tier and talk about the New York Stretch Code, make them aware of its existence, what it entails, the benefits, and maybe the considerations that go along with it. Lou is very much the technical expert on this. For those of you that don't know him, he's the president of Tatum Engineering here in Ithaca. And he can, he'll be going through the stretch code and giving you the details. what we hope to come out of this is, just to give you a rough understanding of what the New York stretch code is, but also to, give you that primer so that you'll invite us to come and talk to your respective town boards. So Nancy already had us at the town of Ulysses, where we gave a presentation to the town board there. And we're hoping to do this with many more communities. So, please take into account the information we're sharing today, and please consider inviting us. We understand that COVID is a major issue for you, today, and I completely understand that. So we're not talking about short-term. New York stretch is, here to stay. So we can do this, in the future as well. So without further ado, Lou, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Terry. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully I can make this happen. There it is. And start slideshow. So this stretch code is a more stringent code compared to the regular code, which there's a new version coming out. Brooke is, of course, very aware of all of this, and feel free to chime in, although I don't have much time, so may have to limit you a little bit. But so this is the idea. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what changes are happening with it, what the benefits are, and what you can do to find out more about it. Code is we think easily adoptable local energy code. It is a little bit more work than just the code that is coming out in a few weeks, but it still should not be much of a lift to make that happen. Some of the things that it can do is it helps to provide a healthier building with this pandemic we're in, improvement, and definitely a big thrust of it was to reduce the energy usage of our new and renovated buildings. The average, like across the board, energy cost savings is about 11%. It varies a lot, and with different situations, different types. And just this is trying to give you an idea of what it can do. So it's something that you can adopt, and then it's an easy for developers to provide a better building than they would by following the new code. And Terry, you definitely feel free to jump in anytime. New York City is getting ready to adopt the New York stretch. The city of Beacon just this week adopted it. Ithaca refers to it in the Green Building Code, which is, I believe. And there's other communities that are looking at it. And here's a house that would meet it, done years ago. It's not a huge stretch for any energy conscious builder to do this work, to do this. Here's for our climate zone. Here's the residential economics. Brooke and Terry and Mark, I did adjust them somewhat for our electric, especially energy costs in this area. But there's significant energy savings, and the additional cost is like for a house, it's somewhere $1,500 to $2,000 per house, and these are primarily new construction, so they generally would be folded into a mortgage, which makes it a hard one. this is an illustration of what we're trying to do is get to net zero buildings, and this dropped the curve towards that. Tension of this, the stringency of this code is to equal the code that will be coming out in 3 years. That is what we're aiming for, is to have that similar kind of a energy savings. So in 3 years, the regular code will be approximately the stretch code. These are the savings. I've gone through and looked at what changes would happen in our zone compared to the regular building code that will be coming out. Actually, no change in the R values. Windows are slightly better, but Energy Star will suffice. All of the pretty much Star, mostly 90% maybe. Better lighting. There's some hot water requirements, but there's 4 different options to comply with that. I always want to make sure that it's clear that there is a requirement to be solar and electric vehicle ready, but that is an inexpensive ask. It's pretty much just making sure that you have a double pole 40 amp breaker space, room for that in the panel, and then to simplify, a conduit out to the parking lot or up to the roof. An empty conduit, doesn't even have to have the wires in it. And then with residential, there's a requirement of the energy recovery ventilator, which is an index. It saves energy by exchanging heat with the exhaust that's going out. And there's additional testing that's required. Now for commercial buildings, I am ripping through this. The cost savings are somewhere around 10%, and incremental first cost somewhere around $2 a square foot. And the payback, again, I adjusted for this because we have inexpensive electric costs in this area. I don't know, many of you are probably aware of that, but it certainly impacts us. And these costs, a due diligence was done. I'm sure they're not perfect, and I'm sure in some cases it will be more expensive than that, and there'll be less savings. But that is what we tried to do as honorable a job as possible. This is Brooke, primarily for Brooke. The compliance paths are going to be the same, slightly amended by the New York stretch, but there's no big change there. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but there's slight changes in the windows and skylights, but not significant enough that it would increase the window cost, and it may not increase it at all in some situations. And you look at it from the R value rather than U example, the roof, when you have a flat roof and the insulation's above the roof, you need to have an additional 3 R value. For the attic, there's another 15 R values, which is probably the most significant change that I have seen. And then most of the wall improvements. Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is the wrong climate zone.
This is climate zones 5, but it's very close to 6. And there are some 5 zones in this area, but you are correct, Brooke. I just recently redid this for another county on Tuesday, and I wasn't able to change it out.
So the numbers change, but the differences don't change very much.
Not
incremental
much
change. Gotcha.
In most cases, they don't change. So that was why I let myself let that happen.
Understood.
Yep, you are correct though. Generally, the change is one more layer of insulation, one like R5 of the styrofoam in these insulation values. But and we are wanting to talk to all of you at more length. So please contact us. You can just email us. I'll have emails at the end. Or we'd love to come and talk to your groups.
What's CI?
Continuous.
Ah.
So it's board insulation. In the last couple code cycles, that has been added, and for very good reason, I think, because of all the thermal bridges that are in most buildings previously, not so much now.
Right.
But that's what the CI is.
So that's the effect of R over the whole surface, not just through parts of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think you could say that.
Great. Thank you, Lou.
Okay. Are we at? Okay.
I didn't know if you wanted me to open it up now for questions or what?
Let me just rip through these last ones. And again, yeah, there's additional requirements, lighting, but they're not huge changes. And then
That's the punchline, right?
EV in the renewables is similar.
Yeah.
What was that? We are going to use natural gas, which we don't. If you do, we want you to have a meter on that so you know exactly how much you are using. Same with any other fuel that you might be using. That's in the script. There's some additional commissioning required. I'm gonna just keep going. And there's a good website that has a bunch of frequently asked questions. And you are, I'll have that's at the end of the presentation also. And here's, it's out now. Again, the new code is coming out in a couple weeks. And there's a bunch of information available. And then here's the website. You can just put in stretch code NYSERDA and you would get to this website. And feel free to contact Terry or I if you have any questions. I believe that's it.
Thanks, Lou. Thanks for your expedited version. So,
kind of fun.
Questions?
Right, so I will unshare. Yeah, any questions?
Are there rural towns that have done this that you're aware of?
None yet, as far as I know. There are some that are looking at it. But yeah.
Okay.
Terry, anything you want to add?
No, I think that was great with the time constraint. It's what we said before. If you're able to invite us to come to present to your towns and villages, we'd love to talk about this in a little bit more depth. And, and obviously we're happy to talk with the code enforcement officers, beforehand or at that meeting as well.
Right. And just one last thing, these buildings, new buildings are going to be there for a long time. So this is a chance to, pretty easily make them better for the next 50 to 100 years.
If I may, I just want to say that I had an opportunity to chat with Lou and Terry, and we had a really productive conversation.
Thanks, Brooke.
Great.
And Mark. Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Yep. So, Brooke, is it your sense that this would not be a huge lift for the code office?
Uh-oh. For the code office, not for the consumer, for the code office.
Well, as far as you I guess there'd be a learning curve. And then,
well, I think the answer to that as best I can is there's a comment that's not specific to the stretch code. I think consistent with what Lou, Terry, and you and I chat about, which is the energy code is another piece of the puzzle that's largely misunderstood by the majority of code officers and very laxly enforced. So it's in and of itself, that comment doesn't speak against the stretch code. But I think that it would be a shame if all of you municipal leaders believe that the energy code is being fully enforced the way it is now, because it just isn't. And I can tell you that as a contractor for 3 decades, and I
Sure.
can tell you as a code enforcement officer.
Yeah.
So the whole secret is that. And one of the interesting things that I just saw, and I didn't understand if it was residential or not, but there was a third-party inspection you were referring to. Is that done in the residential or only in commercial?
Can be residential also, blower door testing and duct testing.
Okay, so nothing different really than today,
No, I don't think
other
so.
than there's enhanced duct testing, which we talked about in certain situations. Okay,
Right,
okay.
right.
So then, in general, I think it's really more of an educational piece for the code officials, which, we have to deal with anyway, like it or not. So
Right.
from a code
Right.
enforcement perspective, I would be hard pressed to say that this is that hard to enforce. I think we just need to have some good conversations about some of those preparatory components, like what is required and acceptable for prepping for solar. Because there's one guy who's going to come along and say, well, I ran the conduit to the left and leave me alone. So at what point in time, those would be just
Sure.
not major things, but they'd be, I'm sure, things that we need to get better guidance on.
Okay, that's just the sense I wanted to get. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Lou, very much.
You're welcome. Yep. Thank you all for doing your work.
Yeah.
Appreciate
So now it's time to, in the next 30 seconds, set the table for the next meeting. And I guess the things that I noticed for tonight, maybe with the water group, maybe, would you want to do the presentation idea and maybe the energy group too? Would that be?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. If it doesn't work, I'll let you know as soon as possible.
Okay.
And maybe we could get started on the CCA, but maybe if the water group is the biggest topic, we could start the process, start the discussion.
Okay. That sounds great. And I guess our group, the emergency services group, I'll see what Rorden thinks. I don't know if Irene's still on the call or not, but if we wanted to produce that resolution for consideration, so that'll be a June meeting. So
Yeah, we're scheduled to meet here in a week or two, right, Mark?
right. So we could work on that and bring it forward.
Okay.
Great. Those are the things that come to my mind. And I guess we'll approve the February minutes. So, any other thoughts about what people would like to see? Talk about?
I'd like to move for adjournment if there is nothing else. And if anyone has any more ideas for the agenda, they can always drop us a line.
Great. Thanks, Betty. I think that's great. So I will move to adjourn.
Thank you all.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.